The cold steel walls of the transport vessel hummed with the gentle vibrations of the ship's engines, but barely noticed. His small, trembling form was curled into the corner of the dimly lit cargo bay, his bioluminescent markings flickering weakly in response to his fear. His home was gone, his people scattered or dead, and now he was surrounded by towering creatures he had been taught to fear. Humans. The stories he had heard painted them as ruthless, dangerous beings, predators that conquered, that destroyed. And yet, they had taken him. They had pulled him from the wreckage of his destroyed colony, spoken to him in calm voices, and told him he was safe. But he didn't feel safe. He flinched when a new figure approached, kneeling beside him. Captain Mara Hayes, a human woman with warm brown eyes and hair, moved slowly as if trying not to startle him. In her hands, she held something soft, a blanket. "You're safe now," she said gently, her voice softer than he expected. Large, black eyes darted to the fabric, then back to her face, his body tensed for some kind of trick. She didn't force it on him. She simply placed it on the floor beside him and waited. Nearby, a taller human with a rough voice spoke. "Poor kid looks like he's been through hell." Recognized him as Davis, the ship's engineer, who had been watching him carefully since his arrival. He wasn't cruel, but he was loud, and still didn't know what to make of him. Mara sighed, her gaze never leaving. "He has," she agreed. "But we're going to change that." Swallowed hard. He didn't know if he believed her, but the warmth of the blanket was tempting. His thin fingers reached out hesitantly, brushing the fabric before finally pulling it over his shoulders. Mara didn't react, didn't make a big deal of it. She simply gave him a small nod, as if to say, "See? No tricks." Something in chest tightened, and familiar and confusing. No one had ever treated him this gently before. The ship's hum changed slightly, signaling a shift in speed, and the sound made twitch. He had spent too long in ships that were not his own, ships that had taken him away from everything he knew. He couldn't trust this van, not yet. Davis let out a heavy sigh and scratched the back of his head. "Think he speaks standard," he muttered. "And understood them just fine, but speaking felt dangerous. Words could invite attention, and attention could lead to pain." He tucked his head further into the blanket, trying to make himself smaller. Mara, sensing his hesitation, gave Davis a look. "Give him time," she said. "He's been through enough." Didn't sleep that night. He lay curled up in the blanket, his wide eyes staring at the ceiling of the cargo bay, listening to the distant sounds of human voices, of boots against metal, of machinery humming. It was so different from the places he had known before. No harsh orders, no terrified whispers, no threats. Just people. Living. Existing. His tired mind struggled to process it. The next day, Mara returned, this time with food. The scent was unfamiliar, but his empty stomach twisted painfully, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since before the humans found him. She placed the tray on the floor and stepped back. "Eat when you're ready," she said, and just like the blanket, she didn't push him. Hunger won over fear, and he reached out cautiously, picking up a small, round object. The texture was strange, but the taste was sweet, and before he realized it, he was eating faster, stuffing pieces into his mouth with shaking fingers. He expected someone to stop him, to yell at him, to take it away, but no one did. Mara just sat nearby, her expression unreadable but calm. Davis passed through the bay a few minutes later, stopping at the sight of actually eating. "Hey, progress," he said with a grin. Mara gave him a look, but there was no mistaking the small satisfaction in her expression. It was a start. A small one, but a start nonetheless. Still didn't trust them. He didn't know if he ever could. But as he swallowed the last bite of food and wrapped himself tighter in the blanket, he let himself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, these humans weren't like the ones in the stories. Maybe they weren't monsters after all. Had spent his entire life fearing humans. The stories whispered among his kind painted them as warlike, unpredictable, and merciless. And yet, As the days passed aboard the human ship, he found himself questioning those stories. The humans had not harmed him. They had not caged him or treated him like a trophy of war. Instead, they had given him food, warmth, and more importantly, peace. He still spent most of his time curled up in the cargo bay, wrapped in the same blanket Mara had given him, but he no longer flinched at every sound of approaching footsteps. He was watching, always watching, studying the way these strange beings interacted with each other. Davis was loud and brash, often filling the ship's hulls with his booming laughter and crude jokes, but he never aimed his sharp words at. In fact, he seemed oddly careful around him, as if he knew how easily fear could take hold. Mara, on the other hand, was quiet but steady, always checking in without pushing too hard. Had expected them to grow impatient, to demand something from him eventually, but they never did. It was unsettling. He had spent his life waiting for the inevitable cruelty, yet it never came. The uncertainty gnawed at him. When Mara approached him with something different. It was a small device, rectangular and sleek, the screen lighting up as she pressed a button. "This," she said, "is a translator. I know you understand us, but I figured it might help if you ever wanted to say something back." She set the device down beside him, then stepped away, giving him the space to decide. Stared at it for a long time after she left. Words had never been safe for him. Speaking could mean punishment, could mean drawing attention from the wrong people. But these humans, they were different. He hesitated, his fingers twitching before finally reaching for the device. His touch was light, uncertain, but as the screen brightened, he saw a simple interface with a text input. A way to speak without using his voice. His hands trembled as he slowly typed out a word, his own language mixing with standard. Why? He didn't know if he was asking why she had given him the device or why they hadn't had him yet. Perhaps both. He didn't know if Mara would see it or if she would understand, but when she returned later, she only gave a small, knowing smile. "Because you deserve a choice," she said simply. And for the first time, wasn't sure how to respond. The days stretched on, and slowly, hesitantly, began to use the translator. At first, it was only small words. "Okay. Hungry. Tired." But as time passed, the messages grew longer. "Where are we going? What do you want from me?" The humans answered every question patiently. Mara explained that they were heading toward a neutral station, a place where refugees were welcome. "You don't have to stay with us," she had said. "But if you want to, you can." The idea that he had a choice in his future was foreign. He had never been given one before. One evening, as the ship's lights dimmed for the night cycle, found himself watching Davis repair a damaged console near the cargo bay. He wasn't sure why he stayed. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps something deeper. Davis noticed and chuckled. Finally got sick of hiding in that corner. Hesitated before typing on the translator. "Watching." The engineer grinned. "Yeah? You like tech?" Considered this. He had always been fascinated by machines, by the way they worked. But his people had never allowed him to learn such things. He hesitated, then typed, "Teach me." Davis raised an eyebrow but nodded. "All right, kid. Come here." For the first time, stepped out of his corner willingly. He kept his distance, but he watched as Davis pointed out different tools, explaining their purposes. It was calming. A distraction from the fear that still lingered in the back of his mind. A distraction from the uncertainty of his future. Mara passed by at some point, watching silently from the entrance before giving a small nod of approval. The night cycle ended, and when finally retreated back to his corner, the translator still in his hands, he realized something. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning. And that terrified him just as much as it gave him hope. Hands hovered over the translator as he hesitated, the screen's glow reflecting in his uncertain eyes. The past few weeks had been unlike anything he had ever experienced. The humans had not only spared him but had also given him choices, patience, and something that felt dangerously close to trust. It was a concept foreign to him, something he had never been afforded before. Trust was a weakness where he came from. It was something to be exploited. And yet, here, among these strange, loud, and predictable beings, it seemed to be the very foundation of their existence. Mara had given him peace, but Davis had given him something else entirely. He had opened a door, had never dared to approach. Knowledge. Every night, Davis worked on repairs, and every night, found himself drawn closer, watching, observing, and eventually, assisting. The first time Davis had handed him a tool, he had hesitated, expecting it to be some sort of test. But Davis had only grinned. You wanna learn? You gotta start somewhere. And just like that, had started learning. It was slow at first, each movement careful and uncertain. But Davis never scolded him for his mistakes. If anything, he laughed them off, offering guidance instead of reprimands. Wasn't used to that. His entire life had been dictated by strict expectations, punishments for failure, and the knowledge that he was disposable. But here, his mistakes were met with patience, encouragement, even praise. It made no sense. One evening, as they worked on a faulty power relay, Davis leaned back and stretched. You're getting good at this, he commented, handing another tool. Stared at him, trying to find the deception in his words, but found none. Instead, he typed on the translator. Why teach me? Davis shrugged. Why not? You're interested. You're willing to learn. Besides, I figure it helps you feel useful, right? That word, useful, struck something deep within. He had spent his life trying to be useful, not out of curiosity or passion, but out of necessity. Being useful had meant survival. But this was different. They weren't training him to fight or serve. They were teaching him simply because they wanted to. Because they valued his presence. He didn't know how to respond. Later that night, as the ship drifted through the ward, Mara approached him in the common area. She sat across from him, her gaze steady but kind. Davis says you've been learning fast, she said, folding her arms. He also says you asked him to teach you. That true? Nodded slowly. He had expected her to question his motives, to suspect him of something, but she only smiled. That's good. We've been trying to figure out what you want, but we figured we'd let you come to it on your own. Frowned, his fingers typing hesitantly. What do you mean? Mara leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. You've been with us for weeks now. You know we're heading toward a neutral station. That means you'll have a choice. You can stay with us, or you can go your own way. No pressure. But I wanted to ask, what do you want? The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that before. What did he want? Freedom had always seemed like an unattainable dream, something distant and unreachable. But now it was right in front of him, waiting for him to take it. And yet, for some reason, the idea of leaving didn't feel as comforting as it once had. His fingers hovered over the translator before he typed, I don't know. Mara nodded, as if she had expected that answer. That's okay. You don't have to decide now. Just know that whatever you choose, we're not going to force you into anything. That's not how we work. She stood up, giving him one last look before walking away, leaving alone with his thoughts. He stared at the words on the screen. I don't know. But for the first time in his life, he realized that not knowing wasn't a weakness. It was a choice. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he thought he was. Sat alone in the dimly lit engine bay, the steady hum of the ship's systems filling the silence around him. His hands rested on the metal surface of the workbench, fingers tracing the scratches and dents that told stories of past repairs and hasty fixes. He had spent weeks here, learning from Davis, watching Mara navigate the complexities of command, and slowly, against all odds, becoming something more than just a passenger. But now, as the ship neared the neutral station, the weight of his decision pressed heavily on him. He wasn't sure when Davis entered, but he felt the man's presence before he heard him speak. You've been quiet, Davis said, leaning against the frame of the bay door. arms crossed over his chest. Thinking. Nodded, his fingers hesitating over the translator before he finally typed. I don't know what to do. Davis sighed and pushed off the diaphragm, stepping closer. Yeah, that's a tough one. He grabbed a stool, sitting beside. Mara told me she talked to you. Said you weren't sure whether you wanted to stay or go. Nodded again, his eyes fixed on the console in front of him. I never had a choice before. The words felt strange, even as he typed them. Davis nodded, as if he understood something and spoken. Yeah, I get that, he said. I know what it's like to live your life being told what you are, what you're supposed to do. Then, suddenly, you're free, and it's like what now? Looked up at him, surprised. You understand? Davis chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe not exactly. But yeah, in my own way, I do. I grew up in a place where expectations were everything. Where you either did what was expected of you, or you became a disappointment. So, when I finally got out, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. He sighed. That's the thing about freedom. It doesn't come with a guidebook. No one tells you what to do with it. It's scary as hell. Thought about that. Freedom had always seemed like an unattainable concept, something distant and vague. It had been easier when decisions were made for him. Even if those choices had been cruel, they had been simple. Now, faced with an open future, he found himself overwhelmed by the possibilities. What if I make the wrong choice? He typed. Davis grinned. Oh, you definitely will. Probably more than once. That's kind of how life works. But you learn. You adapt. And sometimes, you find something that feels right. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Look, no one here is gonna force you to stay. If you want to go, we'll make sure you get somewhere safe. But if you want to stay, well, I don't think any of us would mind. Hesitated, his fingers tightening against the metal surface. I do not know where I belong. The words felt heavier than he expected, but Davis only nodded, as if he had already known. Then stay until you figure it out, he said simply. No pressure, no expectations. Just stay. See what happens. The words settled in mind, turning over and over as the silence stretched between them. Finally, Davis clapped a hand on his shoulder, standing up. You don't have to decide right now, he said. We'll be at the station soon. You've got time. With that, he left, leaving alone with his thoughts. The ship docked at the neutral station hours later. The bustling port was a chaotic mix of species, traders, mercenaries, and wanderers alike moving through the busy corridors. Stood at the edge of the docking ramp, watching as Mara and Davis spoke with a station official. This was it. He could leave. No one would stop him. No one would chase him. He was free. And yet his feet didn't move. He looked back at the ship, at the place that had slowly, inexplicably become something like home. He thought of Davis laughing as he taught him how to repair circuits, of Mara's quiet but firm support, of the strange camaraderie he had found among them. He wasn't ready to leave that behind. Not yet. With a steadying breath, stepped away from the docking ramp and back onto the ship. He still didn't know where he belonged, but for now, he knew where he wanted to be.